Hello, good afternoon. Just wait, sorry. Hi, everybody. My name is Joanne Drum, and I'm with the Education Department of the National Gallery of Ireland. Today, I'm delighted to welcome you to our curator's online introductory talk to our latest big exhibition, which is Méini Djeillit and Evie Hone, The Art of Friendship. That is in the gallery on from the 10th of this month, the 10th of April to the 10th of August. Very much looking forward to this show. I'm just here to do a bit of housekeeping at the beginning before introducing our curator, Brendan Rooney. This is a Zoom webinar, so we can't hear you and we can't see you. Please feel free to have your tea or your lunch or whatever it is, or have a conversation. You won't be bothering us, but we would love to hear from you. So if you do have any questions for Brendan at the end of the talk, please put them into the Q&A box. So if you hover your mouse or your finger over your screen, you should be able to see a little box with a question mark in it. That's our Q&A box. You could type your questions in there. If I could ask you not to put any questions in the chat box, that would be very helpful. The reason for this is because if you do type into that box, it pops up in front of the speaker and that can be quite distracting. So any questions for Brendan in the Q&A box. And if there's any technical issues, please feel free to put them in and I'll answer them during the talk. Without further ado, I'll ask Brendan to turn on his computer and microphone and we'll get going. I'll come back at the end. I'll also mention a bit as well about our program that we have to go on with this exhibition, which we have lots of really exciting things happening over the course of the next few months. Brendan, we're delighted to have you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks,
so
Joanne.
much. Would you like to start sharing and I'll stick around until I'm sure that it's all working? That looks absolutely fine to me. Thank
How
you.
we do? Okay, great. Thanks a million, Joanne, and thanks to everyone who's logged on this afternoon. This is the beginning of a busy week for us, but an exciting one too, as we prepare for the exhibition that opens on Wednesday night and opens to the public on Thursday. So without further ado, I'm going to start a little eccentrically maybe with this grainy photograph from the Evening Mail. It was taken at the opening of the Society of Dublin Painters exhibition in St. Stephen's Green in November 1930 and features familiar figures from the Irish art world, Eva and Letitia Hamilton, Grace Henry and Charles Lamb, and at the centre, the tall figure of Méini Djeillit in the wide-brimmed hat, and to her left, her great friend Evie Hone. It seems an unremarkable image of a kind produced routinely at events like this. The truth is rather different. As far as we can tell, and after considerable searching, this is the only known photograph of Djeillit and Hone together. This seems extraordinary given the 25-year-long friendship that they enjoyed and the fact that both were photographed, often with other artists, several times. In many ways, the photograph is symbolic of Hone and Djeilit's friendship, rare, understated, and significant. As the subtitle of the forthcoming exhibition, The Art of Friendship, indicates, Hone and Djeilit's relationship underpins the project. The exhibition has provided us with an opportunity to mark the artists' shared experience, both personal and artistic, but also, and critically, to explore the different trajectories that their careers and work took over time. These artists remain closely associated, but what truth is there in the claim of Juliette Roche-Glaise that Méini and Evie were so much Albert Glaise's spiritual daughters, one cannot separate them? Remarkably, Hone and Djeillit exhibited jointly just once in 1924 at the Society of Dublin Painters. They both contributed to several group exhibitions after that, but to date, that is the only occasion on which their work was displayed in isolation, if you like, just the two of them. So 101 years later, this exhibition gives us the opportunity to celebrate their friendship and compare their work. Djeillit and Hone's artistic odyssey is, in essence, a tale of convergence and divergence as they cut their teeth as budding modernists together in Paris, but in due course found their discrete professional niches and distinctive styles. The exhibition has been made possible with support from the Cleche Collection, our lead sponsor, Friends of the National Gallery of Ireland, and the Art of Friendship Giving Circle. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to extend my sincere thanks now to all of them. Djeillit and Hone both received their initial artistic training in their native Dublin, but first met between 1917 and 1919 in London as students of Walter Sickert at the Westminster School of Art. Our story, however, begins in Paris. It was there that Djeillit and Hone's close friendship and shared artistic journey began in earnest. It was also in Paris that they embraced the modernist principles that would underpin their work for the rest of their careers. It's been suggested that Gellert was inspired to travel to Paris, having seen an exhibition of the Vorticists in London. And while this may have played a part, it was Hone's presence in the French capital already that prompted Gellert's move. Both artists attended briefly the atelier of André Lhote, a conventional cubist, if you can use the term, and a celebrated teacher. However, they soon tired of the relative orthodoxy of his particular form of representational cubism and approached the more radical Albert Glaise, the rather dashing character you see on the right of your screen, in pursuit of what they called pure abstraction. Glaise initially declined their approach when they arrived unannounced on the doorstep of his studio on the Boulevard Lannes in Paris, but was won over by what he called Gellert and Hone's tranquil assurance, the decided tone of their words. It's important to remember that Glaise was at this point in 1921 just 40 years of age himself and still in the process of formulating his own thoughts on art and its role in society. And it was principally for this reason that he didn't take on students. Gellert and Hone, as a consequence, became collaborators as much as students in the conventional sense and played a key role in helping Glaise to refine and articulate his thoughts on cubism and abstract art in general. They were instrumental in the formation of Glaise's principles of translation, which are represented here in the diagram you see on the left-hand side. Translation being the movement of elements from large to small, outside to inside, side to side, and rotation, the circular movement of elements around an axis, which were fundamental to his artistic philosophy, but weren't published until 1924 in his book La Peinture et ses lois, Painting and its Laws. So Gellert and Hone were already painting in this style before Albert Glaise actually had the opportunity to publish his theories of translation and rotation. Glaise appreciated their role in the development of his work, reflecting as late as 1948 that it is to Maenie Gellert and Evie Hone that I owe the general structure and principal lines of La Peinture et ses lois, essentially his manifesto, and my gratitude to them remains today as warm as ever. Gellert and Hone's choice of Glaise and decision to pursue pure abstraction was itself a maverick move. Even in Paris, the birthplace of Cubism, resolutely non-representational art was treated with suspicion. It was really associated with architecture. Glaise, for his part, set himself apart from his Cubist predecessors, believing that their work relied too heavily on traditional models, particularly when it came to notions of volume and movement. Painting was, he maintained, the art of bringing a flat surface to life. His thinking was crystallized under Gellert and Hone's influence, but simultaneously accelerated the evolution of theirs. The simplest and boldest compositions produced by Hone and Gellert in Paris, of which these two examples by Gellert are good examples, adhere tightly to these principles of translation and rotation. Modest in scale and understated in color, they locate Hone and Gellert at the vanguard of international abstraction. Gellert proved particularly well disposed towards Glaise's philosophy and his methods, and as is clear from notes she took during her very first lesson with him in December 1921. If Cubism was merely a means of presenting anecdotes, information, she wrote, it would have been more or less pointless. Cubism, as it had been defined, explained since its birth, must open the way for a new order, correspond to the needs of a new age. This language, employed here for Gellert's own consumption, these were notes she wrote for herself, is entirely modernist in its character, forward-looking, technical, intellectual. As you can see, early pictures like the examples on the screen involve the rotation around a single axis of a single element. Gellert herself would later suggest these early paintings under Glaise, notwithstanding their elegance and harmony, were experimental and perhaps a little severe. Later in the decade, both she and Hone would introduce into their compositions multiple elements that occupy their own space while complementing and interacting with those adjacent to them. These so-called multi-voice compositions also began to feature a variety of new motifs and accents, as you see it particularly in the work on the right, dots, spots, lines, cross-hatching, etc., that suggested texture and modulated colour. Reviewing Gellert and Hone's joint exhibition in Dublin in 1924 in the Dublin Magazine, Seamus O'Sullivan, who was familiar with the work of Albert Glaise, declared that the Cubist philosophy of space had always proposed as an end the animation of the picture plane, which means rhythmizing space. O'Sullivan's critique was perceptive, particularly when it came to the analysis of Gellert's work and the parallels that could be drawn between it and music. Gellert was herself a gifted pianist whose musicality was discernible and remained discernible throughout her work in its cadences, harmonies, and syncopation. Gellert and Hone were both diligent in the implementation of the principles that they had formulated with Glaise, and their art would never be as aligned as it was in these multi-voice, non-representational works. It is, in fact, often difficult to distinguish one artist's work from the other, as you'll find when you visit the exhibition, and particularly in the early rooms. They were very different personalities, however, whose capacity, or perhaps their inclination, to adhere rigidly to Glaise's principles differed. Lady Morrow, in her review of the joint show of 1924, suggested that while Gellert was the cleverer artist of the two, Hone was the purer. For clever, we might read exacting, and for pure, we might read instinctive. And there is certainly some truth to this. The similarities in their abstract work were attributable to the collaborative circumstances in which they were made and the strict principles that dictated their appearance. Indeed, Gellert and Hone's work often resembles closely Albert Glaise's own work and the work of some of his future students, among them Robert Puyo and the Australian ceramicist Anne Dangar, with whom Gellert and Hone became and remained friendly. However, some margin for self-expression inevitably presented itself, as Gellert and Hone developed their own palette and pictorial lexicon. Hone proved over time to be a more expressive colorist than the more measured Gellert, a quality in her work that was recognized by critics, Thomas McGreevy declaring her one of contemporary Ireland's more distinguished colorists. Hone's understanding of color would also in time inform her stained glass design, which we'll get to in due course. Hone's impulse to depart from the prescriptive extremes of Glaise's training extended almost tentatively to line and form as well. In this wonderfully vibrant composition of the late 1920s, which is one of the first paintings you'll see when you visit the exhibition, she includes a curious detail delineated in black at the bottom right. It looks a little bit like a Kenwood chef or something. This and similar embellishments in other paintings is attributable to Hone's habit of making amendments to her pictures. Gellert was disinclined to allow himself such latitude. One of the qualities of Glaise's principles was their adaptability. For example, Glaise believed that the application of order and balance to complex abstract compositions, ensured by extensive preparation, by which he meant multiple drawings, allowed them to be impactful regardless of size. He described examples by Gellert and Hone specifically as full of promise of being able to grow into works of monumental stature. This scalability is epitomized by the painting on the left you see here by Gellert, the tallest picture in the exhibition, and the work on the juxtaposition of this with a drawing which you see on the right, and in the center, Maternité, a gouache by Evie Hone, one of the smallest works in the exhibition. As this pair of pictures indicates, Gellert and Hone also executed pictures in the early 1920s that pointed to Cubism's more representational origins. These two pictures, executed just a year apart, read as still life paintings, in which items of different shapes and scale are arranged across a flat surface. Still life was central to the development of Cubism, and the motif of the chessboard, which you see particularly in Gellert's picture on the right-hand side, with its regular geometric pattern and contrasting color scheme, was a favorite among modernists in the early decades of the 20th century. Juan Gris, for instance, painted chessboards or introduced chessboards into his works many times. Gellert and Hone were energized by their studies under Glaise and were hugely industrious. However, the increasing complexity of their abstract paintings, with the subtle suggestions of volume, depth, and texture, drew them slowly but inexorably back towards figurative painting. Pure abstract art could not sustain the breadth of interests that they had or their desire to interrogate ideas of spiritual and the material world. Their return to figurative art, after several years of commitment to pure abstraction, was manifest first in subjects that were either explicitly religious or had their origins in religious art. This was in itself unsurprising, as both artists were individuals of deep faith. Gellett had also declared her modernist credentials in Dublin several years earlier with a painting entitled Decoration, which many, if not all of you, will know well from the gallery's own collection, and you see on the left-hand side here, which owed a clear debt to religious art of the past. It is arguably the most significant modernist painting in the history of Irish art, landing like a comet on exhibition in Dublin in 1923. It excited widespread debate that involved several prominent cultural commentators, among them George Russell, who dismissed Gellett's abstractions as artistic malaria and subhuman, and the critic with the Irish Times, who declared them an insoluble puzzle. And his comments were followed up by an article declaring Decoration a freak picture, as you see in the center of your screen, and juxtaposing it with a photograph of an onion. Formally, Gellett's painting was consistent with Glez's principles of translation and rotation, which we saw earlier, which would have been totally unfamiliar to an Irish audience. However, the unprecedented hostility that greeted the painting on its display in Dublin was attributable largely to its obtuse and unwelcome references to religious art. Though the title suggested otherwise, Decoration's gabled profile called to mind Tuscan altarpieces featuring the Madonna and Child, while the fact that it was executed in tempera and approximated gold leaf declared its early Renaissance origins. A conservative audience at this time was better disposed to more literal derivations of religious subjects, of the kind you see on the left by Father Jack Hanlon. This is a later picture, but I include it because Hanlon was subsequently a student of Mamie Gellett, or realist iterations like Patrick Tuohy's The Baptism of Christ, which you see on the right-hand side, which was exhibited at the RHA in 1923, the same year that Gellett showed Decoration. Decoration was also something of an outlier in the 1920s, as Gellett and Hone were focusing their attention otherwise on entirely non-representational work, though this too drew the ire of the conservative establishment. The opprobrium that Decoration had elicited was misplaced, as Gellett was neither ridiculing nor idly appropriating religious art. In fact, religious art, and specifically art of the early Renaissance, provided her and Hone with a template for applying in new ways the principles they had developed with Albert Glez, and for expressing their own faith and spirituality. Evie Hone is often referred to as a religious artist, principally on account of her work in stained glass, while Mamie Gellett's religious paintings are widely considered to be among her most important. However, while Gellett and Hone's deep religious faith informed their art, it didn't define it. Indeed, their faith was quite different from one another's. Hone, exhausted by the negative attention her and Gellett's art had received in Dublin, entered an Anglican convent in Cornwall in 1925 as a postulant. Gellett didn't approve of this decision, but visited Hone there and was the person dispatched by Hone's sisters to collect her when she left unordained a little over a year later. Hone was drawn increasingly to Catholic liturgy and ritual, and ultimately converted to Catholicism in 1939. Gellett's religious observance was more conventionally Protestant, but her art demonstrated an appreciation of devotional imagery that belonged more immediately to a Catholic tradition. Their adaptation and interpretation of historic religious art was sophisticated and personal. Both spoke of their work with almost evangelical zeal, but recognized in early Renaissance and in due course medieval Irish art qualities that transcended religious denomination and appealed directly to the spirit. The exhibition features several examples of Gellett's and Hone's religious works, prominent among them Gellett's large and celebrated painting that you see on the left, Homage to Fra Angelico of 1928. It's a really big picture with a great presence. The painting, based on Fra Angelico's Coronation of the Virgin from the Uffizi of 1432, which you see on the right, coincided with a commission Albert Glez received to design a mural for the parish church in Serrières in the Ardèche in France. Enlisted to help Glez, Gellett produced analytical drawings of Fra Angelico's composition based on illustrations from books. and reduced the composition to its principal elements, contours and palette. Her rereading of Fra Angelico's work was ultimately more radical and successful than Glez's own. Gellert exhibited the painting in Dublin in 1928, and the broadly positive critical response it received was attributable to the fact that, unlike decoration, it declared its origins and expressed spirituality in a modernist manner that was both acceptable and comprehensible to its audience, so unlike decoration of just a few years earlier. The composition is pared down and economical, one critic referring to it later as the bare bones of the work that inspired it, but the critical figurative elements remain, as you can see here. By contrast, when presenting herself with a similar challenge, Evie Hone adopted an even more reductive approach and took the extra measure of assigning descriptive or secular titles to almost all her ostensibly religious works. This is not indicative, however, of an inclination on Hone's part to distance herself from religious art, but rather to capture something transcendent in it. James White encapsulated her achievements perfectly in this regard when he wrote the following about a comparable picture by Hone of the 1920s. Each form has been abstracted and reordered in the new harmony. In the same way, the colors can be seen to make a harmony which have a sensation equivalent to that to be found in the work of Fra Angelico, but without any resemblance. Recalibrating religious subjects, realizing them as abstracted compositions and emphasizing their spiritual rather than their narrative character, satisfied Hone and Gellert's appetite for pictorial order, spirituality, and what they increasingly called truth. It was an impulse that Hone would have missed sorely during her sojourn in the convent. Though she would have expected to be able to continue painting and drawing there, the resident community, otherwise accepting of her previous vocation, deemed art a distraction, and she didn't produce any art when she was in the convent. Hone and Gellert's religious pictures were equally consistent with the philosophy promoted by Glez, who himself had begun to migrate back towards figurative art and, like Hone, would in time to convert to Catholicism. For Glez, discipline in creativity had characterized the production of all great art. As he wrote to Gellert and Hone in 1928, and this is an extract from the letter that you see illustrated on the screen. It was a rather typical letter for Glez at the time. You can see it's begun Cher, Maney, and Evie, written in tiny letters in French. He wrote, "These people who imagine that a religious expression is supported only by feeling, emotion, sensibility, they never think for a moment that it is with rules that the architects of the religious periods worked and made others work." This quartet of paintings typifies the manner in which Gellert applied Glez's principles of line and rhythm to both Christian iconography and non-representational compositions with equal success. So here you have two representational Christian subjects and two pure abstract subjects. Gellert demonstrated an instinctive ability to minimize extraneous detail, and from the early 1930s onwards, augmented the principles of translation and rotation with a further dimension, arabesque. This involved introducing, initially around the principal elements or perimeter of the composition, more organic curves and borders that intensified movement and bound the arrangement together. And you'll see several examples of this in the exhibition. Ironically, Gellert contributed the Glez-inspired nativity, which you see in the top right, to an exhibition entitled 6 Irish Artists Who Have Studied under l'Académie Lot in Dublin. Hone was also represented in that exhibition. As Gellert and Hone returned to figurative subjects, they diversified, producing works in different media and for commercial and utilitarian as well as strictly artistic purposes. These included textile designs, dressing screens, and posters, all of which are represented in the exhibition, and all of which reveal the enduring influence of their early training in Paris and their embrace of Cubist abstraction. Gellert expressed her thoughts on art and industry through her lectures, articles, and radio broadcasts that had become a regular part of her practice and promotion of art since the 1920s. Again, these echoed the concerns of Glez, who, as a committed socialist, believed that art was a fundamental pillar of a civilized society and was for all. The work on the left, produced for the Winsor & Newton Art Supplies Company, is one of several graphic designs Gellert produced in the 1930s and 40s, and echoes her work for the theatre, which included both set and costume design. On the right, and also in the exhibition, is an example of Gellert's rug design, which represents a particularly practical application of Cubist principles. Both Jellett and Hone appear to have been inspired, if not directly encouraged, to produce textile designs by the great Paris-based Irish designer Eileen Gray, and had exhibited textiles in the French capital as early as 1927. The adaptability of Jellett's Cubist aesthetic to practical purposes was never more clearly expressed than in this dressing screen that you see on the right of the screen. Portable screens of this kind, an inexpensive means of combating drafts, were common in homes up to the early decades of the 20th century and beyond in artist studios, of course, models dressed and undressed behind them. The keen-eyed among you will have registered already that the left and right folds of the screen, of the dressing screen, are exact copies of the painting in the center. Both the screen, which has recently been painstakingly restored by my colleagues in the conservation department, and the painting, which featured in Hone and Jellett's joint exhibition of 1924, are in the exhibition, so you can compare them for yourselves and see that Jellett was typically exacting in the execution of both. Cubist principles were equally evident in Jellett's treatment of other traditional subject types, including the nude, represented here by the picture you see on the left from 1940, and subjects from nature, typified by flower forms that you see on the right. For Jellett, addressing the nude represented a return to her early training under Orpen, Sickert, and André Lhote in Dublin, London, and Paris, respectively. Indeed, the nude was a subject that Jellett never relinquished entirely, but curiously hardly featured in E.V. Hone's work at all. Flower forms, meanwhile, calls to mind an analogy for abstract painting proposed by Albert Glaise. Like a flower, he wrote, it appeals to the eye, it's attractive, but after this initial attraction, the mind or spirit becomes engrossed in its structure. In time, these Cubist accents were complemented in the work of both Hone and Jellett by other inflections, demonstrating the artist's curiosity and their appetite for art of different kinds. A visit in 1935 to the International Exhibition of Chinese Art at the Royal Academy in London, for example, had a profound impact on Jellett. Shortly after her return to Ireland, she visited Achill, where the landscape's abstract rhythms and harmonies and cool, subtle color range brought the Asian art she had encountered in London to mind and inspired a number of Chinese-inflected compositions, like the example of two horses you see on the right-hand side. Jellett, and particularly Hone, Jellett, and particularly Hone, also developed over time a deep interest in and admiration for early Irish art. On the left is a drawing by Hone after carvings on the West Cross at Monaster Boyce, depicting the Old Testament story of Daniel in the lion's den. It's not, however, the straightforward transcription of that design that you might think. Abrasion to the surface of the cross itself meant that its detail had become indistinct, so Hone approximated the figures as they are likely to have appeared originally. In doing so, she may also have drawn on other medieval archaeological artifacts in her reimagining, including the High Cross at Ardbow, County Tyrone, and equivalent carvings in Burgundy. The manner in which Hone wrote about the creators of these early Irish works echoes her and Jellett's observations about early Renaissance Italian art of a kind we've seen already. Celtic artists, Hone concluded, found complete freedom and satisfaction in the realities of form and colour alone. They were to them far more real and far truer than the realities registered by the senses. This is indicative of Hone and Jellett's sustained pursuit of truth in their work, a quality that they had identified in abstraction. The enduring influence of Cubism recurs throughout Hone and Jellett's figurative work, albeit in very different and often subtle ways. In the landscape and portrait on the screen, Hone has introduced floating and rotating geometrical elements in the background to approximate fields on the left-hand side and pillows and bed linen on in the picture on the right that compress the pictorial space and are clearly derived from Hone's earlier non-representational paintings. The charming painting on the right may be a self-portrait of Hone with her beloved dog Silver, or according to family lore, may depict her sister Nancy recuperating at home after a fall from a horse. If the picture does indeed represent Evie, which is what I like to think, It is particularly noteworthy as self-portraiture was a discipline of which Albert Glaise had been dismissive, and neither Hone nor Jellett engaged. In fact, no confirmed self-portraits of either artist are known. The legacy of their Paris training was similarly observable in the work of Mamie Jellett, who retained the mechanics of Cubist composition in her approach to later figurative work. The head of the man on the right, excuse me, presumably the head of Christ, is a relatively unusual subject in Jellett's oeuvre. It was quite common in Hone's, but clearly owes a debt to pure abstraction, as you can see from this comparison with a picture by the same artist from the early 1920s that also features in the exhibition. And if you aren't convinced by that, I'll just get rid of the rather Egyptian-like eye in the center of the picture on the right, and it becomes even clearer. So there you go. Another strong influence on Hone was the French artist Georges Rouault, who received a similar reaction from traditionalist circles in Ireland to that endured by Hone and Jellett some 2 decades earlier. Rouault was one of the great exponents of religious art of the 20th century, reinterpreting biblical and particularly New Testament subjects in a notably somber and often challenging way. His uncompromising storytelling appealed to both Jellett and Hone, and his use of bold outlines, typified by the picture you see on the left, informed the development of Hone's art, particularly her stained glass. Hone and Jellett were among a group of Irish artists to champion Rouault when his work, Christ and the Soldier, the picture on the left, became the focus of public debate in Ireland in 1942. Having been offered as a gift to the Hugh Lane Gallery that year, it was rejected on the grounds that it was neither legible nor respectful. Hone's defense of Rouault featured echoes of observations she had made about other art forms. His work, she argued, expressed in the idiom of this period the great traditional truths that were eternal. Hone and Jellett's admiration for Rouault, who they never met, was steadfast and enduring. While Jellett's admiration for the French painter was expressed in her writing and lectures, Hone's was borne out in her work. Though their protests in 1942 were inconclusive during their lifetimes, they were not in vain. Rouault's Christ and the Soldier finally joined the Hugh Lane Gallery collection in 1956. By the late 1930s, Jellett and Hone's rehabilitation was complete, whereas in the early 1920s, they were causing uncomfortable turbulence in Irish art circles. By the late 1930s, they were receiving the endorsement of the state. In 1937, Hone received a commission from the government of Eamon de Valera to design a 3-light window for the Garrison Church in Portobello, and just a few months later, Jellett was commissioned by the state to design 10 murals depicting Irish life for the Ireland Pavilion at the Glasgow Empire Exhibition of that year. That's what you're looking at on the screen. The designs on the walls at the far end and to the left are by Jellett. On the screen now, you can see her design for one of the murals, which constitutes a heavily stylized cultural and industrial map of the island. Jellett's inspiration was not lost on her audience, the Irish press noting perceptibly that Miss Jellett has done the panel after the Chinese scroll style, one picture blending into another. And this rather large preparatory work is in the exhibition as well. The following year, Evie Hone was approached again with a similarly prestigious commission to design a stained glass window for display at the New York World's Fair. The gouache study in the exhibition, the picture on the left, is one of several Hone produced, but approaches the finished design, which is now located at the top of the staircase in government buildings, very closely. Hone's design, entitled My Four Green Fields, features the emblems of the 4 provinces of Ireland: the Red Hand of Ulster, the Golden Crowns of Munster, the Harp of Leinster, and the Eagle and Dagger-bearing Hand of Connacht, against an almost kaleidoscopic pattern of abstract and semi-abstract elements. The enlistment of these 2 avant-garde artists to undertake state commissions, which would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier, reflected the government's ambition to promote Ireland abroad as a modern state. As you've seen, however, Hone and Jellett approached the challenge in very different ways. While Hone's window is meticulously ordered and vibrantly coloured in a manner redolent of her Cubist paintings, Mamie Jellett's design, replete with traditional subject matter, was relatively conventional. Hone's 4 Green Fields, alongside ecclesiastical and domestic pieces, demonstrate the degree to which stained glass design proved for her an art that allowed her to explore pure color, bold abstracted design, and more ethereal qualities like spirituality. Her interest in the medium dated back to her early contact with France and visits to the celebrated cathedrals of Chartres, Le Mans, and Poitiers. She concentrated on painting through the 1920s, but in 1932, having produced some test designs, applied to join on Tour Glyna, the pioneering stained glass studio established by Sarah Purser in 1903. Purser's refusal of Hone's application on the grounds that she had received no formal training merely strengthened Hone's resolve. She duly enrolled in stained glass design at the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art under the direction of the eminent A.E. Child, and by 1935 was a full member and shareholder of An Tour Glyna and was undertaking church commissions. Stained glass artist Patrick Rainchins described Hone's work as a stained glass artist as a dramatic breakthrough that proved to be the herald of a new period of cooperation between the eye of the painter and the eye of the artist in stained glass. As you might expect, the majority of Hone's stained glass works that were realized remain in situ in the buildings for which they were produced. However, she also made test panels for experimenting with colors or to present as samples to prospective clients, and small-scale domestic pieces. Some 13 small panels of this kind feature in the exhibition, and they're a real delight to see. I think they'll be an exciting addition for the visitors to the exhibition. Even in diminutive versions of finished designs, Hone's demand that windows should be readable from a distance rings true. She routinely managed to reduce her subjects to their essential elements, again in a manner akin to her composition of abstract paintings, and to maximize the impact of color. It's particularly evident in the picture you see on the left-hand side in this small panel of the Virgin and Child. Her judicious use of leading, delineating elements while binding the whole composition together, and descriptive line, meanwhile, recalled strongly the calligraphic drawings of Georges Rouault. Among the examples of her stained glass work in the exhibition are samples from Hone's magnum opus, the east window of Eton College Chapel, one of the most celebrated examples of stained glass design of the 20th century. On the strength of her burgeoning reputation in Ireland and Britain, Hone was entrusted with designing the replacement for the window at the renowned English public school that had been destroyed during the Second World War. Her design, covering over 121 square meters, features in its upper register a depiction of the crucifixion, and in the lower, the Last Supper, and took some 4 years to complete. Now, obviously, the actual work itself isn't in the exhibition, but we do have a cartoon, which you see on the right of your screen here, of the design, and several small panels of details within that. These include this beautiful piece, which is the largest single panel we have in the exhibition. It corresponds to the Last Supper, and you see circled at the bottom the particular detail that it corresponds to. And also this beautiful head of Christ from the crucifixion. Hone described surface detail sparingly, preferring to allow bold patterns and vibrant color to dictate the overall impact of her designs. She adds volume to her figures through subtle tonal variation in a manner reminiscent of Rouault, and you see that particularly from the head of Christ. However, she avoided, even in her gravest subjects, the heavy somberness that characterized much of Rouault's work. Like Rouault, wrote Irish artist Brian O'Doherty, the bedrock of Hone's work is an inclusive pity. But in her, Rouault's frozen world is warmed by a vision more tender, more hopeful, less despairing than his. In her, Rouault's winter gives way to spring. As I mentioned earlier, though Hone relied heavily on ecclesiastical patronage, she also produced occasional secular subjects in stained glass. She produced this example, which is in the exhibition as well, for her sister Nancy Connell. It depicts in a luminous patchwork of colour the driveway to Nancy's home in Leixlip, and bears a strong resemblance to Hone's many representations in various media of the woodland around Marlay in Rathfarnham, her home from 1930 and the location of her stained glass studio from 1944. In the many views of Marlay that Hone produced in the final years of her life, she demonstrated a return to the land that she shared with her old friend Mayne Jellett. Again, this suggested the influence of Albert Glaise, who was critical of industrialization and argued for a return to the land, particularly among artists. Hone loved nature and the landscape, and painting the woodland around her home provided her with a welcome respite from the considerable demands of completing stained glass commissions in her studio. Failing health made travel more challenging as she grew older. She suffered complications from the infantile polio she had contracted at the age of 12 and that had left her with compromised movement on her left side. But she continued to take to the road, both within and outside Ireland. And a wonderfully rich and varied collection of sketches and studies in gouache and watercolor record her visits to the Irish provinces, to France and Italy, and the modest subjects to which she was habitually drawn. She was evidently proud of these works, exhibiting some at the Watercolor Society of Ireland and working many others up into finished oil paintings that were reminiscent of her stained glass design. There's a room dedicated to these late works by Hone and Jellett. These works reflect Evie Hone's widely understood love of the natural world around her. Passionately fond of the country, wrote the Irish leader, she sees colours in her surroundings as only one so close to the landscape can understand. Mamie Jellett also returned more purposefully to the landscape in the final years of her life, depicting not just Ireland, but to some extent notions of Irishness. Unlike Hone's sketches of places she visited, Jellett's The Land era of 1940, which you see on the screen, seems to be the product of reverie and nostalgia as much as direct observation, though it does have details you would associate with the west of Ireland. An attempt to capture timeless pastoral Ireland in a distinctly modern idiom, it reflects Jellett's view of the disjunction between art and the industrialized world that echoes that of Albert Gleizes. People who have annihilated their artistic emotion, Jellett wrote in 1934, by their life in the big modern cities full of ugly conveniences manufactured by the machine, are further from the true sense of form than simple people and, of course, artists themselves. Jellett painted this picture at a moment of significant change and uncertainty, 3 years after the ratification of Bunreacht na hÉireann, which confirmed Éire as the official name of the state, just 1 year after she had been commissioned by the government to produce murals pictorializing Ireland for the New York World's Fair, and of course 1 year into the nightmare that was the Second World War. The painting, which romanticizes the west of Ireland specifically in a novel and idiosyncratic way, suggests that Thomas McCreevy spoke rashly when he wrote in 1924 that so far as the aesthetic value of Jellett's work is concerned, it is of no consequence whether it is done in Paris, in Dublin, or in Ballydehob. Other late works by Jellett referred more pointedly to Irish culture and tradition. In the painting on the right, entitled The Virgin of Éire, Jellett presents her audience with an image of the Madonna, a familiar motif in her work, as we've seen, but on this occasion flanked by the quintessentially Irish figures of St. Patrick on the left and St. Bridget on the right. If Jellett's Virgin of Éire addresses subjects of Irish faith and devotion, her Western Procession, which you see on the left, considers religious practice as a social and traditional phenomenon, one that had captured the attention of Irish artists from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries and had ancient pagan origins. The picture on the right is Charles Lamb's monumental Pattern Day in Connemara of 1935, which Jellett is very likely to have seen at the RHA. Western Procession, which has very recently joined the National Gallery of Ireland's collection, is a particularly significant work. It featured in the inaugural Irish Exhibition of Living Art in 1943, which Jellett had been instrumental in organising, but was too ill to attend, and perhaps even more poignantly, is understood to be her last work. Jellett's late Irish subjects are Gleizes-like in spirit, if not in form, and demonstrate that abstract cubism still had a part to play in the representation of the divine, but also in the reinterpretation of both society and the natural world. Rather than being a clumsy rearguard attempt on Jellett's part to hibernicize, to make Irish French modernism in a way that would placate her critics, these pictures embody her sincere ambitions to promote in Ireland a pictorial language that was modern and legible to a wide audience. As we've seen by the early 1940s, Jellett and Hone's styles had diverged to the point that their shared origins are perhaps not immediately discernible. However, a broad review and comparison of their work, which we hope this exhibition encourages and accommodates, demonstrate how formative and valuable those early years in Paris were. The influence of Cubism on their work endured. as did their friendship. Mamie Jellett and Evie Hone travelled to Paris as academic students, but returned as bona fide modernists and remained lifelong friends. Jellett died in 1944 at the age of just 47, Hone 11 years later, while leaving her parish church in Rathfarnham. Their contribution to Irish art and culture was immense, and not just as practicing artists, though that's been the focus of my talk today, but as champions, teachers, collectors and donors, organisers and confidants. They were as popular as they were respected, giving confidence to their successors while enjoying the affection of their peers. I hope that our exhibition, which features over 100 artworks in different media, casts their remarkable achievements in a new light, and that you will enjoy it when you get the chance to visit. Thank you.
Brendan, thank you so much for that. That was excellent, really interesting, and really giving loads of context and sort of texture to their lives and to their art. So it's very exciting. I haven't gone in to see it yet. It doesn't open for a couple of days, but very much looking forward to it. If you'd like to stop sharing your screen there, that would help people be able to see you as you answer any questions. As I mentioned, any questions that people have, please put them in the Q&A box. That would be very, very helpful. So very earlier, when you were speaking at the start, Linda has asked, she said, thank you so much. And she'd like to know if you see any place for the work of Caroline Scally in the realm of the work of Evie Hone and Mamie Jellett.
No, I'm not familiar with it. So
Nor
no, but I will make a note of it.
Yes, and I'm sure if Linda has any information, she can send it on to me.
Absolutely.
She has my email and I'll pass it on to you. That would be really helpful. Thank you so
Great.
much.
Thank you.
I also mentioned earlier that we have a really extensive program of events to go with this. So we have other art historians who are going to be speaking. We've got Joseph McBrien, we've got Michael Waldron. We also have two artists, Susan Connolly and Brian Fay, who, like, it just shows how even today the work of Jellett and Hone is having an influence on artists, and they're hugely influenced by the work of mainly Jellett and Evie Hone. So they'll be coming in to speak about their work and the influence that these two artists have had on them. That's going to be on Thursday, 15th of May in the Gallery Lecture Theatre. But people are probably wondering how they can find out about any of this stuff. The easiest way to do it is to go on our website and to look up the Hone and Jellett exhibition, or Jellett and Hone exhibition. And underneath there, if you scroll down the sort of brief information about the show, there's event posts for every single thing that we're doing. So all of the tours, all of the workshops, all of the talks, the drawing. We're having an open studio set up this summer. So there's loads and loads going on. We're really excited about it. Go to the website, look up the Jellett and Hone exhibition, and you'll find all the information there that you need. And some of these things are completely free and you just book in. Some of them are, they're not even ticketed. You can just come along, and some of them are ticketed and paid, but you can see what suits you best. Brendan, Anna is saying she feels excited having listened to you speak. Claude is saying thank you very much for a wonderful talk. That she was very interested in your final remarks describing Evie and Mamie as champions, teachers and confidants, and she's wondering if you could speak a bit more about the character of the women themselves.
Well, one of the things I discovered, or I'd known a certain amount before, but what became emphatically clear as we looked at the artists in detail is how they managed to bring people with them. And that was by virtue of their personalities. They were very engaging, very sociable and warm people in both cases, but they were also organizers and doers. So they were radical thinkers, but also radical doers. So they were involved, for instance, in the formation of the Irish Exhibition of Living Art, which I mentioned only briefly. Mm-hmm. Mamie Jellett never attended because she was too ill. Its first exhibition was in 1943. She died in 1944. Mm-hmm. That was a huge undertaking on the part of those artists who were involved in it, and Mamie Jellett was one of the driving forces. So they were involved in both at a kind of an organizational, institutional level, Evie Hone was a member of the board of the National Gallery for something like 12 years and attended diligently most of the meetings, if not all of them. And in fact, when she joined the board of the National Gallery, she was the only woman on the board at the time. But they also were incredibly respectful of their own peers, but also very much engaged with artists of a younger generation. So the last image I showed was of Evie Hone at the Irish Exhibition of Living Art, talking to Louis Le Brocq, who remembered very well the support that both Jellett and Hone had given himself in the early days of his career. They were involved with the White Stag group and were hugely encouraging. So they managed to be radical thinkers, but also inclusive and brought people with them. And they also appealed to people who came from an entirely different artistic tradition, an academic tradition, for instance. So they rubbed shoulders with James Slater and Sean Keating and others whose ideas about arts, but also about Irishness and the state would have been quite different from their own. They were amazingly generous and warm individuals.
Wonderful to hear, and not only in the context of the importance of their own work, but their importance to the development of art in Ireland is wonderful. Billy is asking, he says, thanks for a brilliant presentation. And his question is, what was their personal relationship? And did they live together and were they a couple?
They weren't a couple. They didn't live together, and in fact, that intense period of interaction was in the 20s. And even then, they weren't based in Paris the whole time, so they would have traveled back and forth. And in fact, there are letters written by Evie Hone to Ménie Jellett from Paris, bringing her up to speed with what she had been learning from Albert Glaise when she was training there. So no, they were not romantically involved. They lived quite separate lives, but they always remained in contact. Evie Hone was one of the last people to see Ménie Jellett before she died. She visited her in her nursing home the night before she died. Obviously felt her loss deeply after she died, but they were part of a very supportive artistic circle, an artistic community, which involved all sorts of people that our audience will be very familiar with, like Margaret Clark and Norma Guinness and the Elizabeth Rivers. The list goes on and on and on. So they were part of a broader artistic circle, but they had this special relationship based on their experience in their 20s in Paris.
Absolutely. Thank you. Anna, who said she's really excited about seeing the exhibition, is now thinking a bit more. And she says when she's traveling, she likes to visit the graves of artists and composers and writers. Where are these ladies buried?
Evie Hone is buried in Rathfarnham. She died rather, I don't know, aptly or appropriately. She might have approved of it. She died in the doorway to her parish church in Rathfarnham, so she's buried a short distance away. And Ménie Jellett is buried in her family plot in Dublin, but I off the top of my head, I can't remember if exactly where. So I'm not going to mislead anyone by saying it. I'm sure somebody on who's logged in will know. But I know I'm not going to mislead by saying.
Thanks. Dervla is saying thank you so much for the detailed lecture and that she likes to learn, she'd like to learn the very specific technique of translation and rotation for herself and to teach her students. And is there a step-by-step technique detailed anywhere that she could refer to?
Well, the easiest thing to do, well, if you want to read the original French, that book that I illustrated at the beginning from 1924, La Peinture et ses lois, which was basically Albert Glaise's manifesto, outlines what's involved. But Ménie Jellett in particular has been written about in some detail by Bruce Arnold and many other scholars since. And the methods that they used, which was based so importantly on drawing, has been, well aired. So actually, the best thing you could do is consult the preparatory drawings. We have a fantastic collection of these here in the gallery. You can consult those by appointment in the print and drawing study room, and that is the best way of doing it because you can track their process from beginning to end. We have some of the final paintings and the preparatory drawings, of which there are many. There are also some in the exhibition if you want a taster. So we have some of those preparatory drawings. Now, it did involve repetition and discipline and time, but it's very straightforward. And the whole idea was for it to be applicable and scalable across your work. But as I kind of intimated, it actually proved limited ultimately for all of the artists that I mentioned, both Glaise and his students.
Great. Philip is recommending painting is saying that Painting and Its Laws is translated by the late Peter Brook, who also
Oh, it
did a
was, yeah.
biography of Gles.
That's right. Yeah, Peter Brook was the great authority on Albert Gles, who wrote wonderfully about him. He's not long dead actually, but he wrote beautifully about Albert Gles. Yeah.
Okay. And Billy says, thank you, Billy. He's looked it up on Google that Gellets is buried at St. Fintan's Cemetery in Sutton,
Right.
which
Yeah,
is
that rings a
right
bell. Yeah.
beside my primary school. So I'm sure I've probably encountered it at some point. Brendan, thank you so much for a really enlightening talk and introduction to that exhibition. Thank you so much to Lisa and Orla for your translation. It's been really helpful. The exhibition opens in the next couple of days. Tickets are available online. Information to all our programming is also available on the website. So thank you all for joining us and have a lovely afternoon. Thanks, folks.
Thanks,
Bye
Joanne.
bye.